The goals for today's workshop is really to start facilitating the groundwork with all of you here present today. We're going to listen to some of your challenges from representatives of ERNs, representatives of patient organizations, clinicians, fair experts. So it's great that you are all here. And hopefully we can have discussions on what could we do and improve the situations of PROMs and PROs in the context of ERNs and fair verification processes. But before we go any further, Marco has a nice activity for us and he's going to moderate it. So I'll give you the floor, Marco.
Thank you. I'm going to try to moderate this. I don't do this every day. So I've created a question, just one question in Mentimeter. You see the link here, and you on your phone you can use your QR scanner, or you can go to menti.com and fill out this number, and then you should see a page where you can fill out what you associate as a challenge with PROMs. What is the first thing that comes to mind? You can do this this for multiple times, so you can have multiple challenges, and you can add them all, and then a word cloud should emerge, and then we know what you think are the challenges for PROMs.
Marco, could you paste the link and the number on the chat so we can actually click on it? Would that be possible?
That would be possible. Oh, wait, actually.
Yeah, I can
you
do
can
it.
also
I
just
have
go to menti.com and then fill in the number. You don't need to fill in everything after the slash after the com. It works if you do menti.com and then the number, but whatever is easier.
Yeah, I put the link in the chat.
Yeah, and so did I, so you can't miss now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So then, Nawel, I'm curious if you go to the next slide, if it actually appears in the PowerPoint, the results. Okay, it doesn't. I have to share my screen.
Okay, so I stop my screen.
Yes. So. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
So you see everything appearing. So now we get please continue. So there's a lot actually. So that's we see subjective and patient-led. So now I'm curious for some of these terms. So for patient-led, is that patients need to lead it? Is that a challenge in itself? What's the?
Hi, Marco. My name's Kate Hayes. I work for the European Cystic Fibrosis Society for their clinical trial network. And that was my comment, or one of my comments, because I think it's important. A lot of these tools are created by perhaps from a clinical expertise, perhaps by clinical psychologists or by treating clinicians. And we've been working with CF Europe, the patient organisation federation, to try and develop a patient-created tool, so one that is meaningful to the patients because they have actually created the questions for it. Yeah. So I didn't have enough space in the answer box to fully explain that comment, so I hope it makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's that makes sense. So in a way, the challenge is that sometimes it's in some cases it's they are defined by can I say it by the wrong people in principle.
Yes, yes,
That's what you're
yes,
saying.
precisely. Yes,
that's
exactly.
the challenge.
So it's
Yeah.
an inherent challenge before it even begins, almost.
Yeah. So I see. Yeah, this is a great list because this is a starting point for all of us, and I think also for the next presentations for Mark. And I guess we shouldn't go into deeply everything here, but this may come back later in the discussion session, unless there's some that you think are really interesting to raise now that you see in this word cloud. Hard to measure and make it interoperable. Interoperability will be a big topic for the next session by Mark. Getting patients involved as a challenge, I think that's also really nice. Well, they're all nice. Longitudinal data in PROMs. Yeah. I would say, Nawel, also for sake of time, I think we should move on, right, with the program, and then we can come back to this word cloud anytime we want. This is already a really nice result. We already have a result from this workshop, so that's
very
really
good
helpful.
start. Thank you very much, Marco. So
I'll stop sharing again.
Why don't you just keep it to save time, and then you can be my helper? Is that okay? You can. We can go to the next slide.
Oh, but this is from Mentimeter directly, so I don't have
directly. No,
the
okay. Well,
yeah,
then I share my.
I'll give it back to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, there is a way to share also these results with all of the participants. I'll look if I can find that link as well, so we can all see the word cloud.
Okay, so what I wanted to say next is the why. Why are we talking about this particular subject today? Because it is a top priority for ERNs to achieve health care interoperability, but PROMs are vital tools in capturing valuable information for patients, by patients, and also to be used by clinicians to provide better care. But also ERNs intend to verify PROMs data sets. But before we go any further, I think it's worth just looking at what do we mean by interoperability. It is the eye of FAIR and the most challenging, but it is about FAIR enables health records written in different languages, formats, and stored in different registries to be combined. So that's the idea. To do that, to be able to connect different resources, we need shared understanding of meaning, captured in digital form by semantic models based on our global ontologies. And Mark Wilkinson will treat us to a great presentation very shortly about this particular topic. But we also need a set of common data elements. We need to deploy FAIR data point, and we need a special language, the Sparkle language. This is all technical, but it's also worth to very briefly define the PROMs as being questionnaires measuring the patient's view of the health status. The PROs are health outcome directly reported by the patient, and ERNs are European reference networks. They are virtual networks of specialized providers across Europe, and we are very lucky today to have some representatives of some ERNs. And so a gentle reminder that yes, today is about initiating the discussions. Lastly, please mute yourself if you haven't done so yet, and use the chat box for questions or raise your hand. And yes, the meeting is also recorded. So I think I just have to thank everyone who's been contributing for the organization of this workshop. And we can start with the speakers. We couldn't have hoped for a better person to start. I'm just going to stop sharing my presentation. We couldn't have hoped for a better person to kick off this workshop. It's a real privilege to have with us Elizabeth Froome. the chair of the World Duchenne organization, who will give us her perspective on the challenges on PROMs and PROs from the patient's perspective. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. I will open my presentation. Sorry, I just showed it, but now I did not show it.
Maybe while you're working on that, Elizabeth, I can share with the group that please use the chat for questions, anything that comes to mind, and then we have a record of this chat. So even if we don't get to it during the workshop, we have your questions there.
Are you able to see my screen now?
We can see your slides, Elizabeth, yes.
Okay.
Maybe you can put it in presentation mode.
Yes, I did.
Then it's okay, Elizabeth. Please go ahead.
No,
we can see enough.
I did in presentation mode, and it's in my computer. It's full screen, not in your.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, then you might be sharing the wrong window. So maybe you need to reshare. Stop sharing and then share again, and then choose the window where the presentation is.
Okay. Don't you think this takes too much time, and I better enlarge just this or not? If you see it like this or not? Okay.
Yeah, if you don't have animation, then this works well.
No, I have an animation. So sorry again.
That's okay, Elizabeth.
This is what I hate most, right? We all hate most.
We're amongst friends, and we're all drinking our coffee. We're good.
It's best sometimes.
Sorry?
It's best to share your screen first and then go to presentation mode. So if you do the presentation mode before.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I did. Weird enough.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you may have a choice between sharing your screen and sharing a window.
Yeah, I think Mark was right. That's what's happening. Is the screen sharing and the window sharing are not the same.
Okay.
I think that's the
Maybe
main source of confusion for most.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really a zoomer. That shows now, right? So what I will do is I still do the slides as I did before. Then there's an animation which I have forwarded to the organization. So with the animation, we can ask to use that. Is that okay, Nibu?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Then we open this. Let's go. I think we were better like 10 minutes ago. So
just a suggestion.
Sorry, it was
no, it's good.
You want something else? No.
No.
Okay. This is a story, the interoperability of PROMs in the context of ERNs and understanding the challenges. And already Nawel said something about the definitions of PROs and PROMs. We all know it's often a mixed up, that people use PROs and PROMs as the same word, but it's definitely not. And I want to go a little bit further than Nawel did. And I really want to emphasize that a PRO is something which directly comes from a patient without amendment or interpretation of the patient's responses by a clinician or anyone else. Because we all know how much people like to have their own interpretation of things, but this is really not allowed in the PROMs and the and the pros. And then what is the PROM? That is really, it could be a questionnaire, but in fact, it could also be something else. But it's the tools and the instruments used for to report the pros. So PROMs, for example, allow for standardization, validation, qualification at the EMA or FDA, which are important things if you want to use PROMs for outcome measures. You can have trademarks, you can license it. It's really a tool. It's not just the answer or the outcome. So this story is going on for a long time. Some people think it's quite new. It's not. We've been talking about this since ages. And I see in 2015, ERDIC already said patient-reported outcome measures can provide evidence on the impact of the disease and treatment on patients. Patient-reported outcome studies require rigorous planning, methodology, partnerships, etc. But very important is also the next thing they said, and that is clinical trials do not systematically measure outcomes that patients consider important or relevant. And I think that is, again, and also I just heard somebody from the cystic fibrosis group say that PROs and PROMs are fantastic instruments to measure what is important to patients. But then the starting point also has to be what is meaningful for patients. We all know of stories about outcome measures. For example, there was a cream developed for, and it appears at the EMA, for burn wounds, right? And they were measuring how the skin looked, and the skin looked better, blah, blah, blah. So they thought, this is fantastic, this is a fantastic drug. But then, or cream. But then the patient said, well, you know, the redness of the skin is something, but what really matters to us is itching. And the itching get rather more than less with this cream, so we won't use it. So they really started from the wrong point. That was not a PROM, that was a normal outcome measure. But anyway, for a PROM, I think it's as meaningful as for other outcome measures. We should start with the patients. So now I have a video. Maybe you have the video, Nibu, right?
Yes, I will share my screen quickly.
Because I'm afraid it won't work in this mode I'm using. But it's relevant to see. We asked, this was for Duchenne non-ambulant patients. There were no outcomes at all. And we asked them, what would be relevant to you if there's a drug? What would you like to change, or what would you like to stay the same? And the outcomes were quite interesting. Okay. Can you start it?
Hi, I'm Justus. I'm 18 years old and I live in Amsterdam. And today I'm going to tell you about what's important for me. For me, most important is that my heart and lungs keep working the way they do. And so without the ventilator, it would be great. I mean, just to be able to do things as normal as possible with as less equipment as possible. And then second of all, my arms are very important for me. I mean, yeah, without them, you can't really do a lot. And then my hands are most important to use them with typing, or for example, with the remote control of this wheelchair, because for me it's also, I like it a lot, this wheelchair, and would like to be able to drive in it as long as possible. And then second of all, my lower arms and upper arms are also quite important, because now, for example, when I have to put my arm on the table, I have to do it like this, which hurts at your fingertips a bit. So it would be easier a lot if you could just, lift your upper arm yourself. So that's something what I would like to improve a bit. And then for using the computer, it's also very important that your hands keep working the way they do. That's about it.
I used to be able to put my hand up on my own, but there's no chance that I can do that now. It doesn't work. I can still move my fingers enough to drive the wheelchair, to use the joystick, and I can still use the computer. So that's really important to me, because I have to ask people to do so many things. It's good that I can still move around with the wheelchair and use the computer. Yeah, it would be really bad if I couldn't do that. So that's something really important.
Thank you, Anibu. Could we go back to my screen?
I can't do that myself. You have to do it again, sorry.
This is the best day of my life, I'm sure. So otherwise I can just, it's not that important that I show the slides. I can also, can you see it again now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So what we did is we interviewed patients, not only these two, but we interviewed a series of young men, all from Europe, but from different countries. And there was definitely a common denominator, and that was being able to put your arms on the table. Nobody had ever measured that or thought about that. That was so important to them. So then we, with this, we went on and started first to develop a pool, which was the performance of the upper limb, which was really a physical outcome measure, and then also a PROM. And both are published, so it's really easy to find. This is the development of the functional outcome measure, and this is about the patient-reported outcome measure of upper limb. You also see it took us like 5-6 years, so it's a whole process to go from what is relevant to the patient to having a validated outcome PROM. But we did, and we were happy we did. It's now recommended by FDA and EMA to use in clinical trials. So that is really the story where it started around the patient, like we just saw in the Menti, that is a question how to start from the patient. You can do it, and please keep away scientists and clinicians who say, yeah, I know everything about PROMs, let me do it. I mean, maybe the technology, maybe the statistics, maybe the rationalities, but not the questions to be asked. And I think that is something which really should echo all the time. So then the question for today is, what are the challenges? I think the reuse of the outcomes, I'm very happy that Mark is speaking. One of the problems, of course, is that the reuse of these outcomes, because it is, you want to use them not only for one small project, you want to keep being able to use them over and over. Also, you want to collect them longitudinal. And that is one of the things which is still not happening a lot. PROMs are used ad hoc for a certain project or a certain drug development, but we don't have, let's say, the natural history of most of the PROMs. So that is really an issue we should think about, and I think registries could provide that opportunity, but we can speak about that a little bit later. We need a validation for specific disease groups. We have learned that, for example, quality of life questionnaires, which were kind of the first famous PROMs, let's say. Everybody knows that quality of life is often asked by insurance, by HTA, by regulators. But if it's not really sensitive enough to measure changes in a specific group, then they're still not very useful. A PROM, it's not just a PROM and you pick a PROM from the shelf. You really have to think about, what do you want to measure? What is the group? And how can it be specific enough? So we've seen that in Duchenne, we haven't found a quality of life PROM that is sensitive enough to measure changes during the duration of a clinical trial. So the University of Sheffield is now working on some outcomes, but it's still quite difficult. And then we come to the registries where we have the pros most of the time. So patients filling out their own outcomes, and we need standardization there. We are far, even in Duchenne, where we're very active, we are really at the beginning of standardizing the pros so we can really compare things. Interoperability is an opportunity, etc. So we really have to work on that to ask the simplest question in a standardized way. So we've seen like certain simple questions saying yes, no, or yes, no, maybe. Well, then you're already in trouble, right? But I'm sure Mark will tell more about that. So I think also registries, we in the Duchenne data platform, we have and the PROs, so the questions about all symptoms, etc. But also we use, for example, the PARS, that's a participation list. And that is really a PROM validated for the disease. So I think for me, for the future, registries would have PROs which are interoperable and PROMs which can make a collection, a longitudinal story of the PROM. So with this, thank you, Noel. And sorry for the hassle with the teams. I hope you could still see.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was a great presentation. Maybe I could ask the participants if they have a question, or now is the time, or you could write it in the chat. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask Elizabeth any question that you might have. Okay, it seemed that it was very clear, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. But you know, the participant can also write their questions on the chat, and we will try to answer them after the workshop. Or we have a question from Leo. Okay, so you developed your own, I read it, Elizabeth, or you can read it too. You developed your own PROM. PROMs can be divided in a disease-specific and a generic part. For the generic part, did you focus in the development on the disease part or also on the generic?
Thank you, Leo. Now, in this one, we really, this is a disease-specific. But of course, there are two types of PROMs, you know, the disease-specific and the more general ones. And also there you could see there are things in between, like, for example, we could have PROMs focusing on children with muscle disorders or something like that. So I think the generic are used very much to see what in healthcare, how healthcare is performed and so on. But when it comes to clinical trials and drug development, I think you hardly can use these generic ones.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Before you go, do you have any words of wisdom for us all? Because you have so much experience in regards to PROMs and PROs, and you know what you are trying to achieve with FAIR and interoperability. What do we need to be sure to keep in mind?
Well, one is that's not easy. The other is that it's worth doing it. So we have to work. On this, and we can learn from each other, I think. But it's a long story, so that's also something to keep in mind. It's something to start today if you want to have something in a couple of years. It's not something which you have overnight, especially when you want to do well. And then there's a question from Kate. What was the most challenging aspect of developing the PROM? Well, I can see it will be hard to have the right team to do it. We had, which was amazing. We were lucky to have clinicians who were willing to see that the patients were in the lead, and also we had people who were very good in how such a PROM should be developed. But I also should say that we had a version 1, and then after testing it a lot, now there's the pool PROM 2.0, so you might have to revise it as well. But that's, I think, if that's a challenge, I don't know, but it's a reality that you might have to revise a PROM and have a 2.0 or maybe even a 3.0 if you see after a while which items are more sensitive than others. Does that answer your question, Kate?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Now we can maybe move to the next presentation. Mark, you next. Thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's humbling to follow Elizabeth, I have to say, because I'm going to be speaking to you from a purely technical sense, and I hope that I don't put you to sleep with it. So I'll try to keep it a little bit light, but still informative. So I was presented with the challenge of making the pros and the PROMs in the Duchenne registry interoperable and fair. And so that led to the question of what does a semantic pro or PROM look like? And so we started, of course, from a fair perspective, we always start with ontologies. And I just want to define ontologies for anyone who isn't entirely familiar with them. They're categorizations of things and relations, and they've been around forever. And some categorizations...
Mark,
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. You mentioned fair a couple of times, so maybe you can quickly say what fair was.
Sorry. So fair is a movement towards improving interoperability in all data systems, and it has a few general guiding principles that are aimed at ensuring that both humans, but more specifically machines, are able to at least discover and retrieve and hopefully integrate data on their own. So that's the objective of FAIR. And a lot of FAIR is grounded in these things called ontologies, which are both human and machine readable representations of knowledge, largely categorization systems of things that can exist in the relations between them. And some categorization systems are better than others, and so I'm going to be a little bit humorous here. So the originals, widely regarded as the original ontology, was from Aristotle, and he had 10 categories of substance, quality, quantity, and so on. And those fall into quite a nice hierarchy of how you could view the world. And there are some other ontologies that are not particularly useful. So this is the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge classification of animals, and those that belong to the emperor, embalmed ones, fabled ones, stray dogs, and so on. So that's clearly not a very useful ontology. So we had to decide, both from a structural and a meaning perspective, what ontologies were we going to use to represent PROMs. And so what is a pro or a PROM from an ontologist perspective? Well, it's a question which is answered by a person at a specific time, perhaps on behalf of another person, and that answer provides information about the severity of some phenotype. So from an ontologist perspective, we're going to change those words. So it's an information content entity engaged in a process with a participant at some metadata time. There's another participant potentially that generates another information content entity, and so on. And so from an ontologist perspective, we think of these things differently. We think of them at a much higher level. And so we then said, all right, is there a single model that could represent all PROMs? And from there, we went to the Common Data Element Modeling Group of the EJP, where I'm also involved, where we're trying to design a single model that could represent the common data elements from the EU RD registries. And we eventually built this model. I'll go into it in a bit of detail, but on the right-hand side is Dr. Michel de Montier, who is now at Maastricht. And this is the semantic science integrated ontology and one of the design patterns that comes out of that ontology. So let me just go through in a bit of detail. We have patient identifiers of various kinds, identifiers to denote particular roles. An entity, for example, the human or the model organism or the device has a role in that role, which is realized in some process, which is usually some kind of measuring process. The process has an output, which is, again, an information content entity. That output refers to some attribute, some phenotype, for example, and the entity has that attribute. And so this is the circle of information, process, roles, participants, outcomes that we built for the CDE. And so the question was, can we use the same model for PROMs and for pros? Well, the answer was almost. So there was a couple of things, just to remind you, there was a couple of things that we, excuse me, we didn't have in that model. And one of them was the question. So I've got down here in the right corner, the original model, you'll see that it's by and large identical The only thing we had to add was that this process has an input, which is a question, and that question refers to some ontology term, and it has some output value. So as Elizabeth said, could be yes, no, maybe, or it could be some more specific answer. And again, that question, it refers to, and then we formalize all of the pros and the PROMs in that registry so that they now have unique identifiers so that we know exactly which question we were asking, regardless of which language it was asked in. That's part of the requirements of FAIR. So what we had to add onto the model was this relationship between a question and a phenotype, and then we had to build an ontology of all of the questions that could be asked. So the process of preparing the PROMs for FAIR was to create a new ontology, so the DPP ontology, which was rooted in SCIO. And then for every Duchenne PROM question or pro question in the database, we create a new ontology term that represents the question. We add the question's database ID as metadata of that term. This is a bit technical, but I'll show you why it's necessary in a moment. Then we had to map the question to a human phenotype ontology term and add that term as the metadata of the new ontology term. All right, so let me show you what that means. So this is what our ontology looks like for the Duchenne PROMs, or the Duchenne pros. I think they're pros, actually. Elizabeth will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've been calling them PROMs, but in fact they're pros. So here's the, sorry?
I said, yes, they are pros in our...
They are pros. Okay, so I've been calling them incorrectly the whole time. So this is the address. So again, it's an address that will never change because it doesn't matter where we keep the ontology, we can redirect from here, which is a requirement of fairness. The ontology full hierarchy is on the left, and I'll just highlight some things. So here's the hierarchy. Here's the concept that I've selected right now, which is a bone health and orthopedics fracture concept. This is the database ID in the Foundation 29 database. This is the FAIR ID, which is the global identifier that can be used to refer from other databases into this one. This is some metadata, and if I click on that, you'll see that I've actually got information about the mapping to the human phenotype ontology that is represented by this particular question. So we've done a lot of gathering of information into this reliable and queryable structure, which then we can add in to the overall model of what a pro will look like. So here's what we're doing. We're doing the Hpo mapping. So the question has to refer to some human phenotype ontology. We then extract the question and we put that into its own ontology. We generate the entire FAIR model and we include the patient's answer. All right. So if you look at the overall process of preparing PROMs for FAIR, we have this, creating ontologies, adding questions, mapping the questions, adding the HPO terms. Well, I'm a software developer. In fact, actually, I'm a botanist. So which step in this process am I unqualified to do? Well, the answer is this one. Mapping the question to the HPO term is something that I am not qualified to do. Right. So for example, if I'm faced with a pro question related to getting up from the floor, and in fact, this is the question that is in the Duchenne pros, I say to myself, is this a question about muscle strength, which is a phenotype ontology term called 1230? Is it a question about fatigue, which is a different phenotype? Or is it a question about coordination, which is a different phenotype? And only domain experts are qualified to make those decisions, and it can't be automated. I was able to get to the point of recognizing that it could be about one or all three of these, but I couldn't make the decision which. A machine could not make that decision by itself either. So artificial intelligence can only go so far. And in fact, if a machine were capable of making that decision, it would be because somebody had already built an ontology to describe that question. And therefore, it would be able to do that mapping itself. So we're doing the very first step in building AI systems which can understand these questions, you can't just have the AI make that decision by itself from the get-go. So, my advice about adding pros or PROMs, first see if there's an existing system that can be reused, so the R in FAIR. So if there are existing questions that are appropriate, existing questionnaires, it's really good to reuse them because it removes a lot of the ambiguity about comparing one pro question with another pro question. At the moment, the best we can do is say, well, they are about the same phenotype, even if they are different questions. And that's the closest we can achieve to interoperability, at least at the first cut that we've done so far, is that we've said, well, we can at least map to a phenotype, and therefore we could compare pros between different systems that have different questions based on the phenotype that they're assessing. If you're building from scratch, remember it's interdisciplinary, and Elizabeth said this, it's interdisciplinary. You have to find both the right clinical people and hopefully at the same time the right FAIR people to be working together to build what will automatically be an interoperable PROM. What we had to do in this case was largely build the interoperability on top of something that existed. So I would suggest that if you design PROM questions from scratch, do the mapping in parallel. So the phenotype mapping, do it in parallel with the question design, because you might ask the question differently. If you examine the phenotypic ontology terms that are available, so you may see more or less nuances in the phenotype ontologies that would cause you to ask the question slightly differently in order to more precisely address that phenotype term, with the knowledge that the phenotypic term is the intersection between your questionnaire and somebody else's questionnaire. Or at least, again, at this first pass of interoperability, that's the closest we were able to come. So, thanks to Elizabeth and Miriam, and so Elizabeth had already done some initial work on the Pro to Hpo mappings, and we picked up that and continued it. Marco and his team, Peter Bram and his team, and Pablo Botas at Foundation 29, and Mario from my company for collaboration and expertise, and finally, of course, Noel, who is managing all of these efforts in collaboration with the teams above. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
It's fantastic, Mark. There's a question on the chat from Leo. And maybe before going into that, this must have raised lots of questions with all of you. So either use the chat or raise your hand. It's also perfectly fine if you ask, can you explain that part on that slide again or a little bit deeper? Then that's okay too. It doesn't have to be a very worked out question.
So I can't answer Leo's question because I don't understand it. There's two parts I don't understand. What is the generic part, and what are validated programs?
Okay, can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Generic is basically non-disease specific, like for instance fatigue or muscle strength and or well-being. Those are basically quality of life indicators which basically can be measured across all disease entities. But that's what I mean with generic. You do have specific disease-specific items which still have to be developed, I think, for a lot of disease entities. But a lot of the things are also generic, so they don't have to be developed, and there are already excellent programs available. So the only thing is that we still need to make them interoperable, to do the semantic modeling and link the ontologies to it. But you've got to realize, if you've got a quality of life, if you go for a PROM, that the whole process of validating and measuring and setting it up is a long process, will take a long time, and you do need to run several studies just to validate it, just before you can use it. So that takes several years. It's not something you can do in a couple of months.
Does that provide you enough clarity, Mark? Seems to me that's also an opportunity.
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. It's really it's a question to Elizabeth, not to me. I'm doing clarification, not PROM building.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing that you can explain, and then definitely it were to Elizabeth, but there's an element that I think it's an opportunity to explain a bit about how hierarchies in ontologies work.
Mm.
So that
I'm going to pass directly to Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Well, I think what Leo was asking, that's what everybody asked at the beginning, why would you start something new? And that comes to the sensitivity, and the preferences. These both could be quite specific. And we have learned the hard way, like with the quality of life, everybody felt like quality of life is quality of life. It's not that simple. So I agree, when there's something there, which is sensitive enough for what you want to measure or where you want to use it for, then it's fantastic. Of course, as I said, it takes long, it's a lot of work. But on the other hand, if you end up with something which is not useful, then it's a waste of time and energy anyway. So, and patients already get too many questionnaires. So I think we only should give them the questionnaires which are really good enough to give an answer to the question we have as researchers or organizations or regulators. So I agree, if you can use it, but you will fail many times. Yeah.
And maybe I can add to that to reiterate what I think is the importance, also what Mark mentioned on doing the mapping to ontology terms at the same time as defining your pros, because I think basically that is also very much about reusing. So then people can define what they think is important, but in that mapping process, in doing that iteratively, you start looking at what already exists, and that can influence what you then eventually conclude will be your pro, will be the thing that you think needs to be measured. And then several factors come into play in that iterative process. But hopefully also the points that you raise, Leo, to see if there's some generic elements that you can just reuse rather than reinvent.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's first give my presentation, then further this extend on this one. Yeah.
I would love Mark to make one comment, which was really an eye-opener for a lot of people in the wearable, because wearables are pros, could be considered pros as well. The outcomes of wearables, they come directly from the patient. But and then Mark mentioned, Marco, that should be fair at source, and I think maybe you could repeat it. Yes, Marco.
Yeah.
Marco, you want to?
Well, I'll jump in because I brought up this slide when I saw your question. This particular model is an abstract model of something a little bit more complex. So you can see that we actually have devices in this model. And so devices are play the role of blood pressure measuring device or some whatever measuring device. And a human or a patient plays the role of patient. And so these roles can have multiple participants, some of them being medical devices, some of them being individuals, some of them being in the situation of a pro, the participant is a clinician who is administering the questionnaire. The question itself is an input to a process, and so we have the ability to model very complicated scenarios with this, just with reiterating this exact same thing, where in one iteration, it's the medical device that is playing the role in the process. In another iteration, it's the patient that's playing the role in the process. In another iteration, it is the clinician who's playing the role in the process. And we capture all of that, but we capture it in the same way every time. And that is this sort of circular model. So that would be the answer to Elizabeth's question, is that we are hoping that if we provide this skeleton, that the creators of wearables will say, well, I can output my data that follows the skeleton, no problem at all, and that would be a good starting point for making fair at source.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We're gonna give the floor to Leo. Leo has a presentation for us from a clinician's perspective.
Sorry, Nawel, there was one more question by Veronica.
Okay, sorry, I've missed it.
And I think it needs some. I think it's good to give Veronica the floor to explain her question.
Thank you. It was just that I think Mark did explain a bit just now. I had a feeling that we crossed very quickly from very tangible information about PRO and PROMs to very abstract models. So I wanted him to bridge somehow this gap and give a precise example. For example, how is that schematic, how information would go in a particular example through that schematic. But he explained a bit now in the question before. So I was wondering more about the flux of information and how that very tangible information fits in all of the boxes in this schematic. That was, I just felt
Right.
that the passing from one to the other was very abrupt. That was all.
So in the example question from the Duchenne pros was the standing up from supine position. So if we were to look at what exactly that looks like when we capture it, so we have an ontology term, which is standing up from supine position. Then we have the actual question, which is the question can take many forms. It could be digital, it could be paper, it could be whatever, but it's always referring to the same concept. So the question is the question standing up from supine position. It refers to, I don't know, I can't remember the ontology term, which was selected, but let's say it's related to coordination. So there's a coordination phenotype or attribute. That question standing up from supine position refers to that phenotype. The question becomes part of the test process, which has an output, and the answer was 15 seconds. Right, and that answer refers to the coordination attribute, perhaps the coordination attribute, I can't remember. But that's what it would look like. So it would be standing up from supine is a question which is input to a process. The answer was 15 seconds, and it refers to coordination or whatever it is. So that's when you concretize this, that's what it looks like. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, it's very clear.
And maybe I can add for the audience. So this what Mark just showed is a visualization of computable data. This is something we can actually query by computer. This graph. It's nicely visualized, but it is actually computable data. And if you have, for instance, a phenotype identifier in one database for a particular phenotype, and you have in another database the same phenotype, then means we can actually query across these two databases using this model. So it really makes your data computable for data science.
Thank you.
Okay, now it's time for Leo. Leo, please take the floor.
Great, thank you. Can somebody share or start my presentation? I've sent it to Bruna and Nawel.
Okay, Bruna Oniru, can you share, please? Whilst you're doing that, I just wanted to tell everyone that all the work already undertaken in the context of the Duchenne Data Platform FAIR project, including the mapping of our PROs, can be reused or adapted, because the Duchenne Parent project in the Netherlands are making the documentation, the technical documentations available as an open source. So it's good to know. Leo?
Yeah, I can't share my screen, so that's why I asked for Bruna or Nawel to.
Yeah, I'm open in just a second.
Okay.
The problem is I got to leave in 15 minutes from now, so.
Oh.
Oh, there it comes. Yeah, great. You can skip this. Okay, yeah. Next slide. Next one. Okay. Well, a lot has already been said about the PROMs. Basically, you use them to measure the quality of life domain besides the disease-specific elements by having questionnaires which are basically filled out by the patient and are specially designed to measure these items. The value has already been extensively studied, and what you basically see around the world that there is an increasing use because there's a definite shift to a value-based healthcare, and I think that has already been excellently demonstrated in the earlier talks. Now, the quality of life is a broad and overarching outcome domain, so it includes the physical, mental, and social functioning. Next one. One of our PhDs in Amsterdam has put a lot of work into this, and he will defend his thesis tomorrow, actually. Now, if you look at the model of Wilson and Clary, and I took it from his PhD thesis, then it goes from biological function to quality of life. And biological function and functional status is basically something the doctor can observe and make a note of. Biological function can be blood samples or creatinine, or and you can think about the blood tension itself. While the quality of life is something which really needs involvement of the patient, or needs to be filled out fully by the patient. Next. Now the problem is, if you got a PROM, you need to be absolutely certain that it's valid, so that the right questions are being asked, that it measures the things you would like to measure, that's reliable, so it's stable under the different situations, and it's responsiveness, so it should be able to detect changes. What he evaluated in large-scale studies together with the University of located in the States and with the University of Amsterdam and with the Radboud University, that a lot of the available commercial PROMs are not reliable. So we tested for the vascular malformations, the PET-QL, the SF36 and the skin index, and they basically were not responsive enough. Now we further looked into this, and then we found out that PROMIS scales, which is really a brand new one, developed on the item responsive theory and proven with the cats, is a really reliable PROMS instrument to measure the generic part of the PROM. So for the disease-specific one, we developed the OVAMA criteria within the VASCA, within the vascular malformation community. That was done on an EDELPHI basis with worldwide involvement of all the institutes and the patient organizations, and that also has been proven in a large-scale study to be reliable. So we have the OVAMA and now the PROMIS. And the next step was to, next slide. To check the PROMIS. That was also done in a study, so it was basically reliable, and we looked into the interoperable part. So the PROMIS scales do have their own ontologies. It's in linked to SNOMED and to LOINC, and we already did the modeling. That Bruna and Nawel did that. I think Mark was also involved. So that part is basically ready. Now what we encountered was that the moment we started to implement it, that the PROMIS scales, which are very, very reliable again, can be used by every hospital for free. But the moment you start implementing it in large scales registries where multiple institutes are basically involved, a license agreement needs to be signed with the institute to develop this, and there are costs connected to it. So at the moment we're stuck basically in that point. So we have no idea how we're going to solve this, and what we need is probably central coordinated action from the ERNs, because if more ERNs are interested in the PROMIS, we basically could start talking to these guys to see if we can get a discount or if we can get it implemented it for free.
So, Leo, sorry to interrupt you, but there are some messages on the chat that some people have problems with not seeing the slides advance.
Oh,
is that? Can
see it moving, so I have no idea.
Yeah, we have had this before in Teams, that for some they were advancing and for some they weren't. So if people could raise their hand if they have this problem, that the slides are not advancing. Just in the chat or in the, or maybe it's for, so that's all guests. Janice is not here, right? Because we had this problem before. We actually had it at our midterm review of the EJP.
Yeah, I think the best way to solve it is to leave the meeting and come back.
Yeah. So for those who have that problem, then maybe a slight pause, Leo, if you don't mind. But that would be a shame if they can't follow the presentation.
Mm. So what would you
so
like me to do?
No, just wait a bit until they come back. So
okay.
for the guests for whom the slides were not advancing, just go out of the meeting and come back in,
yeah.
And then Leo will start again. So we'll start in 10 seconds or so.
Okay, I will wait.
Yes, I'm sorry, this is a Teams bug.
Yeah, apparently it's working now.
Yeah. Okay, can I continue? So basically, additional to the slides, so what's next? I think that every ERN needs to basically develop his disease-specific prompts. But for the generic part, I think we probably are able to use the already available programs and see if we can implement that. If we do it the other way around, it will take us probably a couple of years before we got it all solved. And again, I don't feel like developing, so I don't feel for it if we to start to develop things which are already available. Okay, Marco, can you take over?
Okay, so that was your
yeah.
Your final comments. Are there questions? And actually, we've been discussing with although I think Nawel, we were discussing that maybe we can do questions until the very end, but you have to leave, Leo. So I think it's important that we do some questions for you right now. If you agree, Nawel.
Yes. If quickly, if you have any questions, please go ahead. Looks like not. Okay.
So so Leo, one of the main problems is that you would like the functionality of this promise tool, but there's an issue with the costs of that, right?
I know that there are several ERNs interested to go for the promise scales. So it might be good if that's true, then basically we have a joint action towards to see if we can anyway acquire these systems and then start implementing them. And again, FASCA is at this moment is at the point of implementing the promise scales into our registries, and we did the modeling, so it's fully interoperable.
Okay, there's a hand now.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. This is Mar from Euroblood.net. Just a rapid question, I think, but is it possible that I see that is really very relevant, this responsiveness of the PROM, because if not, it makes no sense. But is it possible that the one PROM has this ability to detect the changes over the time for a group of diseases, but is not for other group of diseases?
I'm not sure if I get the question.
What I mean is that I don't know, because I'm not an expert on this. So my question is, when we talk about reuse PROMs, that of course this completely makes sense to avoid the duplication of efforts or to remake the same. But I have one question. Is it possible that one PROM that has been developed, a disease specific for a group of diseases, is able to detect the changes over time, but maybe is not for other group of diseases?
I think that part of the prompts, especially disease-specific one, has to be developed for that disease part. So I don't think we can use one prompt for all the ERNs, the same prompt. So we probably have to further develop that.
Or at least to check if the one that is existing, probably we need some, let's say, validation process to see if the prompt is also valid for another group of diseases, right?
Agree.
And also meaningful, because my other question before, my other thought about reuse, that I think that of course is needed, but again, reuse also would need probably some validation for meaning, if it is meaningful for a different group of patients.
Can I sort of quickly comment on that and then make a suggestion for follow-up? I think what the comment I would like to make is that basically to reiterate the importance of doing mapping to standards and ontologies at the same time as defining PROMs, because then we also look at how a certain ontology type relates to another type, so that even if it's disease specific, there's a higher level term that actually is not disease specific. And that is very good for interoperability. And this becomes part of the process then as well. This is what ontologists do. That's looking at these relations at higher levels of abstraction. So that's again nice, I think, for this part of the process. For the promise tool, I'm inclined to think, Noel, and also the verification stewards, that this is something for us to follow up on. Maybe a special session on it. Maybe we should do some evaluation. Maybe make it part of the next session. But that this is one point from this meeting to follow up on in future meetings, and that the EJP can facilitate that.
Absolutely, Marco. Yes, we're capturing all of this, and
so then thanks to Leo.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So we can, I think, give the floor to Bruna. You've all received, or the representatives of ERNs received a survey to assess the situation with PROMs and PROs. And so Bruna will give us a summary of the results. Bruna?
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you. So I'm working with the verification stewards from the EJPRD project side, and we sent this survey to all the ERNs to try to assess what is their status with PROMs. So we wanted to see which PROMs choices they have made, if they already made the choices or still they're thinking about it. And if so, what is the interoperability status of these PROMs? Are they connected to like some coding or not? And identify opportunities to converge. So we got 19 responses representing 13 ERNs from the 24th. And what we got is 4 answered yes and 4 answered no, and some are under development. And the list of PROMs that we got is the PROMIS, CF-related PROMs, some AHC and ATPI A3-related syndrome PROMs. And so basically we have a very diverse, and they all number 1. So basically they were mentioned only once in the answers, and PROMIS was the only thing that was mentioned twice by 2 different responders. And apart from this survey, we also got information directly to the stewards via email, via informal talk in meetings with the technical teams of the ERNs. And we even have more, including the OVAMA that Leo mentioned and the Duchenne PROMs from EuronMD. So we have a very big environment to assess interoperability and see what is disease specific, what is general, and to move on. So from the PROMs that the ERNs are using, are they validated or are they following a standard? From this question, 6 responded yes and 7 no. So there is a need still to validate or to standardize the PROMs. Then we asked, are these PROMs using an existing standard, a coding system, or an ontology mapping? From this question, there was a bit of a confusion, but now after Mark's presentation and others, what we mean by this question is, are these questions already mapped to HPO or SNOMED, ICD, ORFA codes, and so forth? From these questions, we got 5 that are, and then the others are maybe and not. So in this case, the PROMIS, which is the thing that Leo was talking about, PROMIS is like a huge system with many question banks. So each of these words that you see here is like a group of questions in there. And the good things about this system is that it's already in LOINC and SNOMED. So I can, for example, the ability to participate in social roles and activities. I have the whole question list in LOINC. And if you look into one question from there and zoom in there, you see that also the possible answers are modeled. So basically it is ready. So that's what Leo was mentioning, trying to say with a part of the work is already done there. And of course, it is interesting to see how much we can reuse of these or not. And then going back to the questions about the PROMs, are the PROMs that you are using split by general categories? So for example, pain, mental function, social, etc. And most of them are. And then we went to specifically asking about, are they mapped to HPO terms? So that's what Mark was showing you before, how important it is to have the questions connected to what is the question about, which phenotype. And in this case, only 2 are actually mapped to HPO. And the ERNs also shared some extra information that they use surveys in age ranges, and they are not only answered by the patient, but also by the parents. So we call the proxy answering. We have other standards, for example, from the IAHCRC, and they are building standards for coding. Maybe the person that commented this can explain more or less what are these standards about. And we also got the answer that some ERNs only collect PROMs for patients enrolled in trials. So apart from the interoperability part of things, we have other things to consider, and how much useful, or not how much useful, but how much these PROMs are used and when, to be able to collect information over time. So this is what we could collect in this first survey. And I just wanted to show you, to give a base to start this discussion, and we can go more into details on how to solve these probably in the next workshops. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruna. That was quite insightful. I don't know if we have, yeah.
Someone has their hand raised.
Manu, is that an old hand?
Yes, sorry, it was a forward one.
I just wanted to say that we are going to share the minutes of this meeting, like in a summary format, so that we capture all the important points to take to the next workshop. So we can all go away, think about it, and come back next time, hopefully to progress further. So if you think of other questions, in the meantime, please don't hesitate to send them to us. If there are no more questions, then we will give the floor to representatives of ERNs to share with us their challenges. So we have Ando Bond, Eureka, and EuronMD. So I don't know who would like to go first. Any preference? Anna?
Yes, I can go first.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Yeah, I will share my screen. Yes. Okay. Can you confirm that you can see my slideshow view?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to this workshop. My name is Ana Priego. I'm a Eureka Neuroborn Fellow, and I prepared this this short presentation with my colleague Gillian Bryce from Eureka. She's a project manager. And we were invited to share the challenges we have faced when implementing PROMs in the registries. Just as a short background, the European Registries for Endocrine Conditions and the European Registry for Rare Bone and Mineral Conditions were launched in 2018 and 2020, respectively, and our sister projects. They are funded by the EU Health Programme, and they are the affiliated registries of ENDO-ERN and ERN Bond. However, they are open for all centers across Europe and beyond, caring for the conditions they cover, regardless their affiliation to ERNs. The structure of both projects is similar and includes two registries: an electronic reporting tool that collects only the number of new cases, and the core registry, which collects new and existing cases. It includes a set of core data elements. It collects longitudinal core outcomes. And if the patient wants to get involved in the registry, the clinician sends an invitation to create an account. What this explained, the core registry is a platform where we have implemented PROMs. So far, we have only included generic PROMs, and the first PROM we implemented was EQ5D. At the moment, we have 10 languages for adult version, 7 languages for the youth version. We also have PROMIS, some PROMIS tools in English only, and I will go into this a little bit later. And the WHO ICF in English, and we plan to we will add BPI, the BPI short form soon in several languages, and we also plan to expand the languages for the PROMIS tools. There are 2 ways to complete PROMs in the core registry. The first way is by the clinician. He or she selects the PROM. In this case, I use EQ5D as an example, and then the second step is to select which tool and the language. And then he or she can complete when the patient is sitting in his office. And the second way is by the patient, and the clinician can customize a request, the request settings by choosing the type of tool and the frequency of request. And then the patient goes to his or her platform and completes an outcome. And every time the patient does this, the clinician will get an email notification. When deciding on which PROMs to add to the registries, there are some questions that we have to answer, some questions we face. And one of them is, what are the needs of the community? How are certain PROMs accepted by the patients and the care providers? Do they cover their needs? Are there costs involved when using these PROMs? What are the available languages? And to tackle some of these points, we have developed a survey that will be disseminated soon using the Delphi method. And we want to know about what are the relevant aspects of health and well-being from the patients and also from the clinician's point of view. We want to know how often and how long is it acceptable to spend completing a PROM. And also we thought it was worth mentioning that the developers of EQ5D are working on a new tool, EQHWB. And this is a standardized measure of health and well-being, including 25 items, and there will be also a short form with 9 items. The final results will be available in the 3rd quarter of this year. And after that, validation studies and translations will be done, and it will be available for everyone, hopefully in 2023. So we are also looking at that. What are the challenges that we have faced and the remaining questions when we talk about PROMs? One of them is the cost. Often we are not aware that the use of PROMs involve costs and license agreements. Some of them are more expensive than others. Some licenses must be renewed every day, every year on a yearly basis. And you can imagine that when you keep adding PROMs to the list, the costs build up. Of course, as a European-based registry, we need to cover as many languages as possible, and often every language costs. There's one cost for the use of the tool, but then for each language you need to pay a bit more or a lot more. And when we think about the languages, we need to see which languages are available and also which of these translations are validated. depending on the PROM you choose, the list changes. And a tool, for example, that is available only in 2 languages doesn't seem like a good option for the registry. Also, adapting the questionnaires to our platform, considering the tools that we have, and sometimes this can be very time consuming. Regarding the use of the PROM, there are some risks. We wonder, what if we add a PROM, we pay for a PROM, and then we don't know if the community will use it. So that is something that we often wonder. Regarding the access to using a computer to internet, because if you want to use the registry, you need these things. And also the educational level of the users is something important. And with the results of this, when they complete the PROM, we also ask ourselves, what are patients and clinicians doing with the results? Also, we need to implement a scoring system. So that is also something that has seemed to be a challenge. Regarding interoperability, so far we have focused on the first point, interoperability of data elements that are common to all cases and conditions. And a next step would be, or is it something ongoing, the condition-specific data sets and also the PROMs. And something I refer to Bruna's presentation and also to Professor Leo's, the promise items are linked to loin codes. So one of the things that we are looking forward to is implementing these codes into our data dictionary. Yeah, and also, yeah, just adding as a centralized registry interoperability for the users is not a problem. I guess this is different for federated registries. But however, this is a priority for the project, and we expect to get some answers from this series of workshops and some strategies to tackle these challenges. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
So Nawel, should we move on and then have the questions after the ERN presentations?
That's very wise. Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you, Anna, for your presentation, Anna and Gillian. Yeah, so that we don't make sure we don't run out of time, that all the our speakers have enough time to present. So yeah, the next one is Antonio from representing ERN NeuroNMD. Thank you very much, Antonio, for being here. You're on holiday, you're in Portugal, right?
Yes, I am.
So it's very kind of you, and sorry that we're disturbing your well-deserved break.
Okay, so I would like to share my screen. I don't know if I'm able to do it. We'll try. Of course, it's very good that Anna has started by presenting. Are you seeing my screen now?
Not yet. Oh, yes, we are.
Yes, okay. So it's very good that Anna started, because unlike the bone and endocrine ERNs and registries, we don't have the experience of running a registry yet, so we are still building it. So our perspective is much more incomplete. It's interesting, however, that we probably share some concerns regarding the interoperability barriers at the ERN level. And we also were discussing the problem with languages, and it's a good thing that it's been very well underlined by Anna. And what I think about this solution of going for ready-made, expensive commercial solutions is that we are basically running into costs, as Anna has explained. And at the same time, we need to make sure that all our patients in our networks are involved in these efforts. So we cannot exclude patients on the basis of the languages that they speak. So I think that the language barrier is a very important one. and should be addressed not only in terms of the final product, the PRO or the PROM, but also in terms of the sustainability of the solution that we find. So I'm not sure that going for an expensive commercial solution, although it has already solved lots of barriers in terms of work that it needs to be done to harmonize everything to enhance and enable interoperability. It's the best one, but it may be. But we need to then to think how we are going to pay for the price of having languages implemented in our systems. I don't think we should go for a system that basically relies on patients' responses just on English or two or three main languages. We should offer all our patients the possibility of answering PROMs and PROs. So there are some publications about electronic collection of patient-reported outcomes in different languages. We can obviously get some information and some learning from these publications, but at the end of the day, we have both a policy decision, what languages are we going to include, and also a financial one. So we need to know that by including those languages, we can still pay and make things work. The other thing that Anna very well underlined is that we risk to pay things that people don't want to use. That has been the experience, as some of you know, with the tool that is running for European reference networks cross-border health information exchange that is called the Clinical Patient Management System. It is a fundamental tool for expertise exchange across countries and within the European space, but it has been associated with prices and costs that are considered at the moment non-sustainable, and they are basically going for a rerun, making from scratch a new system that replaces the original commercial one. I think that's a very good warning regarding the risks of going for commercial solutions on the long run. We've heard Mark Wilkinson and others discussing the semantic layer barrier, but that's the part that I'm more confident about, because we have very good specialists that can help us with the semantic layer barrier and to help us with the verification of the outputs from our registries, and also the verification of the sources of data towards our registries. I thought it was very important to mention things that are not usually still under the radar. So I think that currently the panorama of people just having an Apple Watch or having a Samsung Watch or having some of those wearables that can derive very important information should be looked into. I think that this should. I thought I was sharing my presentation, but it seems that I'm not. Sorry.
So we see now we see the PROM setup barrier, but I wonder if some of the externals and guests may have this update problem again. We saw that earlier, and the only solution we have is to quickly go out of the call and come back in. That's the only solution we have right now.
Their solution, not mine. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so going further, since the FAIR layer is something that we need to organize and include things like wearables probably, so that we can benefit from the fact that people already own instruments that will give us information about their condition. The other thing that I thought it was very important that Elizabeth said is that there are PROs that are not PROMs, that are not basically curated information, and they are not so formatted. That are very important. So Elizabeth gave an excellent example where a PROM basically missed the target, and the patients were able to explain what was really important for them. And so even non-structured, or I would say non-structured information should be also considered and are organized in these things. And I think PROMs should shy away from being filled by the clinician in name of the patient whenever possible. I think that's a bias, but I understand why, for instance, Anna has said that they were doing it in their registries, because it's still a way of getting some information that patients may not be able to provide by themselves, or because they are not motivated for doing so. I don't know, for several reasons. And then there's this PROM setup barrier. So finding significant inter-ERN PROMs is the challenge here. So we are most of the times talking about quality of disease. We may talk about burden of disease, which is not quality of disease, quality of life. We might be talking about burden of disease as well. It's probably difficult to quantify and compare burden of disease across different diseases, but probably that's a challenge that is also worthwhile. And you know about the therapeutic PROMs and the experiments that have been done in different health services. I put here a paper about the NHS assessment of 4 surgical interventions, and the valorization of the EQ5D reported outcomes. And as you see, we need to be careful with these judgments, because obviously you can conclude that you should not allow patients to be treated by less experienced or centers with less number of cases. In this case, it's hip replacement. But in rare diseases, as you know, that can be a very tricky argument. So we need to be very aware of the HTA and cost benefit or cost effectiveness assessments being derived from the PROMs that we generate. So my conclusions would be that PROMs and PROs are highly desired and highly desirable, that they are very complex to set up, that they have implications for patients, healthcare providers, and national health systems. And we should be very careful when considering each of the layers we are discussing, and the decisions that may be done upon some PROMs and that need to be basically patient-centered. Otherwise, we risk that some very high entities or very well positioned clinicians or health authorities make the decisions for patients. And we think, I think personally, one of the ideas I've heard recently is the idea of including professional grade PROs and PROMs in the electronic health records. I think that's a very interesting idea and should be something that, I know that we are talking about registries, is a better curated or a more structured way of collecting the information, but for me it makes all the senses that we we start having electronic health records with PROs and PROMs on the side of the specialist information that they already contain. And thank you. I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the professional grade PROMs in electronic healthcare that I didn't hear about? This is the first time that I hear it.
Yes, the idea was explained to me by Ian McNichol, is part of Open EHR, which is a consortium that defends a certain architecture where the data for healthcare is provided in standardized formats. And so it makes data for healthcare independent from the software that produces it, because basically it's the same philosophy of open data for clinical trials and things like that. What is common is the format of the information, and the way you use the software that you use to produce it is basically not important. So you basically don't need to care about that. And the idea is that the patients produce PROMs and PROs, and that the electronic health record includes already those shells, those capacities. So when the patient comes to clinics, it's not just the impression of the clinician that gets registered in the electronic health record. The PROs and PROMs from the patient are presented on the site, but there is some protocol so that those PROs and PROMs are presented in a way that is in context. So it's not that there is a censorship of what the patient says, but you have some way of telling what kind of information are you looking at, and to assess that information in a contextful way that lies side by side with the professional information. I don't know if I answered the question.
Perfectly, thank you very much. Well,
I don't know if I managed to unshare my screen or not. I'm sorry, I'm a bit at a loss.
It worked for me. I don't know about the others. Thank you very much, Anna and Antonio. I don't know if we have any questions. For me, I always think I need a bit of time to formulate my question properly. So maybe to give time to the others, why don't we try to see who are actually the participants? Something that we should have done maybe at the beginning, Marco. Maybe just tell us if you're which ERN are you presenting, or patient organization? Are you perhaps a patient? Because this is all valuable information that we could build on it for the next workshop. So could you just say, what you think about the workshop, if it met your expectation, other challenges that have been described, what you had in mind? Have you learned a few things?
And just so you know, I have a slide with conclusions from this session. So while you give your thoughts, then I'll write it down in a little list of initial thoughts that we have about what we learned today. So who wants to start?
But Bruno was suggesting in writing. Should we write on the chat?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're doing perfectly in terms of time. So I don't know how we managed it, but
So so Nawel, you have I still see Antonio's conclusions.
Okay, maybe Antonio needs to stop sharing.
You're not able to take over?
Let me try. I'm going to take control, and then I say
yes.
Stop presenting. Hey. Great.
Because what we could also do, there's another Mentimeter that you can use to share your background with us. A slide that Nawel has. Because I think apart from the ERN, it's nice to know what kind of background, if your background is if you're a clinician, or if you're a patient representative, or if you're a data scientist. It's nice to know that. It's happening on the chat, Nawel, so no worries.
Okay, great. I'm trying to share my...
Oh, this is fantastic what's happening on the chat. We don't need the Mentimeter anymore. Please keep doing this, people. This is fantastic. So there's quite a number of people from ERNs. I had a question for the ERN presenters, maybe for Anna, but also others who are here. Mark mentioned that the work on finding a good representation of your pro is a useful process. We would, as data scientists, we would need it to make the data usable for computers. But I hope also Mark conveyed that there is an added value in actually defining the pros, in doing that in an iterative process. So I was curious if you think this step is in your standard workflow. I think Anna really showed a workflow, right? Different things that you go through. And if not, what you think about that, if that can be incorporated in a workflow.
Yes, well, I don't know if I understand what is the action that, the exact action you're asking about.
So if I would explain it quickly, Mark showed that we use all these codes, right? And we get those codes from ontologies, and ontologies are representations of knowledge. So that it's actually much more than just a code. I think hopefully it also comes across, because often in clinical data, we talk about codes as if it's a one single term, but if you take a code from an ontology, you get the whole ontology by reference. So it's that step, sitting with a domain expert, what is the right code from the ontology for this particular pro.
That is something, as I explained, that is it's some part of our workflow. Of course, we have come across some other challenges, as I mentioned. So we are trying to tackle these things at the same time. Of course, we started by looking for the PROM, looking at what it means to implement a PROM, if there's a license involved, and all these things. But something that I have reflected on while I prepared this presentation and watching some other presentations is that sometimes it can be something that can be done at the same time or since the beginning, and that it would make things easier to think about interoperability when you start planning how to implement certain things in your registry. And as I said, we are centralized registries, and perhaps that's why this has come later. But I think it would make things easier for some of the registries. But yeah, it is in the workflow.
Yeah.
So
maybe
in our
go ahead, Antonio.
Sorry, Marco. So in our case, I think that as we have the advantage of not having anything in place, and our concept is to try and start from mapping everything that we can to ontologies, because we have the notion that it's the right way for the future and for interoperability. The difficulty with that, as you know, and is what you were mentioning, Marco, that we need to have a sit side by side an ontology expert and be able to basically put our questions and doubts along the way. And as you know, some ontologies may miss, I'm not thinking about probably the human phenotype ontology, but for the classification of diseases, we have the ordo ontology, and we miss sometimes some granularity, and that's a work that needs to be done as we go along. So when we find something missing, we need to tell them, but it's, as you imagine from their side, it's also a very complicated process and a lengthy one.
Yeah. So it's good to start early, but we are aware that it's a complicated interdisciplinary process. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So this is what I sort of wrote down as things that coming from the meeting, and I want your contributions to this, because this is just my quick resume. That, well, I think we all agree that pros are important, right? That's an easy one. Then the definition of pros should be clear, and Elizabeth can correct this slide if I got it wrong myself. That there are many challenges regarding pros. I should do an update of this slide. So we have the word cloud for pointing to that. That requires this interdisciplinary collaboration, and I should add there to start as early as possible. So I think what Anna and Antonio mentioned. I also think from Bruna's presentation and also Leo's presentation that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity between ERNs, what they're using for standards, what they're using for tools, what they're considering anyway, centralized or decentralized, a lot of heterogeneity. And that, yeah, I changed the wording actually on the last one, because I think it's not so much maybe about PROMIS itself, but the functionality of PROMIS. That is something we should look into, because that might be an aid in this process, in this interdisciplinary process. And but there's a cost to it, so that's something to look into. Those are my first observations. I'm very eager to hear some more. Maybe Kate, you have a chat there, so maybe you can say that out loud.
Okay, thanks.
Can you add your background again?
Yes, sure. I work for the European Cystic Fibrosis Society, so with their clinical trial network, and I'm based in Queen's University in Belfast. So I just trying to step back from all the great points that have been made this morning. It's been really useful for me to hear the stories and to see the challenges that everybody is facing, to know we're not alone in facing a lot of the points that have been raised today. But also to try and take a step back from it all and say that we have to realise that these PROMs, the information that we collect, has to be used to generate discussion between patients and clinicians or their healthcare team. And we have to be sensitive that the information that we collect is going to be used in a sensitive and meaningful way for the patients, because I know we're talking about the techniques and the technicalities of how we capture this information. But ultimately, we have to remember that we're capturing very important information for patients that may be very uncomfortable. It may really be not just reporting symptoms and the impact physically of their disease or condition, but also the quality of life and their emotional and social consequences of their condition too. So just trying to step back from it all and look at the very big picture of what we're doing with all of this.
And Kate, would you be okay if we expand on that a little bit to say that PROs have multiple types of uses?
Of course,
and
yes.
that it's good to take that into account. So it can be for data analysis,
Of
but
course.
obviously also for the discussion between doctor and patient, and
Absolutely,
that sort of generalizing can be risky.
Of course, yes, absolutely.